Hi, it's Nathan. The Managing the Risks of Falls in Workplaces Code of Practice provides businesses with advice on how to manage the risk of falls and protect workers from falls. So the first few sections talk about workplace design and designing tasks to sort of eliminate the need to work at heights. So for example, if we're installing air conditioners and we're making the decision we could install them on the roofs or we could install them on the ground, it's much safer for the crews if we can install them on the ground. You're sort of eliminating the need to work at heights. Another example would be if we've got tanks that are located up high, having sight glasses on them so we can see the tank level from the ground without having to actually climb up there and either use a dipstick to measure it or look in there. The next few sections talk about workplace control and workplace planning. So for example, if we're going to be fabricating something and installing it on a roof, we can prefabricate it on the ground and then install it rather than having workers on the roof the whole time sort of fabricating it or assembling it on the roof. Another example is if we're using EWPs or setting up scaffolding, making sure that the ground is stable and level. The next sections talk about identification of fall hazards. So we have to identify fall hazards. So like inspecting the workplace for things like drop-offs, penetrations in roofs, fragile roof materials. Work-off ladders is another common hazard. Then it gets into the hierarchy of controls, and this isn't the normal hierarchy of controls. This is one specifically for working at heights, but it is kind of similar. So it starts with elimination, so eliminating the need to work at heights. I gave some examples earlier, but another one would be like, let's say we need to clean some windows up high, rather than getting on a ladder and having to physically get up there and clean them, we could have like an extendable pole to sort of clean them from ground level. Next is work off a solid structure. So an example there is, let's say we've got some really big silos, grain silos that we need to get up on top of to either look inside or do some work. Rather than just climbing up there or leaning a big extension ladder against it to get up there, we could install stairs, handrails, walkways. It's going to be expensive, but it's going to be much, much safer. So we need to consider doing that if we can. And then it talks about fall prevention devices, which is a really difficult term to wrap your head around. If you ask me like, what's a fall prevention device? First thing I'm going to think of is a harness, but in this context, no, it's not a harness. The examples of fall prevention devices are things like temporary handrails, temporary scaffolding, even EWPs are considered a fall prevention device. So they're the first three levels of controls: work off the ground, work off solid construction, and work off use a fall prevention device. And then we get into the more inherently risky controls. So the first one is work positioning systems, with the main ones being a fall restraint system. So a fall restraint system is where we're wearing a harness and we're attached by a rope or a lanyard, but the idea isn't that the lanyard's going to catch us if we fall. It's that we don't actually have enough length in the rope or the lanyard to get to the edge, so it's restraining us from getting to the edge. This is like common, like if you see people working on roofs where they're doing maintenance, they'll get up there, hook up to an anchor point, and the idea isn't that they're going to get caught if they fall. The idea is, well, that this rope will not allow them to physically get to the edge. The other type of work positioning system is industrial rope access, which is like those crazy people hanging off the sides of buildings. Inherently dangerous. A lot of training goes into it, a lot of gear, a lot of safety procedures and emergency procedures. They do things like cleaning, maintenance, painting, when there's really no other way to do the job. And then finally, the least preferred method of working at heights is full arrest. So this does include things like catch platforms and catch nets, but the most common type of full arrest is where you're wearing a full arrest harness, and that harness is going to catch you if you fall. So it's funny because if we think about working at heights, first thing we think of is wearing a harness, and the harness is going to catch us, but that's actually the least preferred method. So the reason that's the least preferred method is we aren't actually preventing the fall. You're still falling, it's just the harness catches you. So you've already fallen, you can hurt yourself on the fall. That's not the end of it. You're now hanging in a harness. You may be able to get yourself down, you may not be able to get yourself down. So that's why we need to have like a recovery procedure and an emergency response plan, because there's this thing called suspension trauma. So the way the harnesses sort of catch you, there's a lot of weight on the straps on the inside of your thigh, and that's where like your main artery runs down into your legs, and it can cause blood to pool in your legs and cause renal failure, which I believe is kidney failure, and can kill you in minutes. So that's not good. So we need a rescue plan and communication. So if someone does fall, they can say, hey, you know, I've fallen, you guys need to come help me. And then the final section talks about ladders. So generally speaking, ladders are discouraged, but yeah, it's recommended to avoid ladders altogether if possible, but you know, it's impossible to avoid use of ladders. Like most workplaces, especially all industrial workplaces, are going to have at least some work off ladders. So there's a preference for fixed ladders if possible over temporary ladders, and then platform ladders over step ladders if possible. And then if we are using, we're allowed to use extension ladders, we're allowed to use step ladders if there's no other way to do it, but then there's a lot of rules in place for those. So for extension ladders, they need to be at a 4:1 ratio, they need to be secured. If we're using an extension ladder for access, there needs to be, as we get off the extension ladder onto the roof, we need to be protected from a fall from that point onwards. That can be difficult in practice to implement that. And if we're working off step ladders, 3 points of contact, have the ladder set up correctly, stable ground, level ground, industrial ladders only light work, no heavy work or carrying items up ladders. Hope that helps.